Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Shakespeare, Sonnet 116. He's talking about canon law. Hello, my name is Father Nightingale, and in this video we're going to talk about impediments. In the first video, we talked about what was necessary to make marriage. Canon 1057 said you need juridically able persons to exchange consent in a manner that is legally or legitimately manifested. And so in this video, we're going to focus on the first of these, what it means to be a juridically able person, and the opposite of that, what an impediment is, which makes someone juridically disqualified for marriage. Canon 1058 gives us a very general account of who can marry. It says, all persons who are not prohibited by law can contract marriage. So anyone, as long as you're not forbidden, can get married. It's something that belongs to the nature of man and woman, and so unless it's something forbidden, it can be done. Now, there are a number of rules that pertain to who can marry and who can't marry, but the only ones we're going to focus on in this video are what are called diriment impediments, or just generally impediments. Impediments are those laws which say that someone cannot validly marry for one reason or another. Impediments pertain to two different sources. They either come from God himself through the establishing of nature or through the teaching of Jesus Christ, or they come from the church. They're called ecclesiastical laws, which the church has laid down, and because the church has laid them down, the church can also remove them and give permission to marry in certain cases. So we'll go through each of them. There's 12 different categories of impediments, and as we describe them, we'll also say whether they pertain to natural and divine law or whether they pertain to ecclesiastical law, and in that case, who can dispense them. You can find all the specific impediments listed in Canons 1083 to Canon 1094, and they are briefly age, physical impotence, prior marriage, disparity of cult, sacred orders, a public perpetual vow in a religious institute, abduction, crime, consanguinity, affinity, public propriety, and a relation through adoption. So we'll explain each of those in a little more detail. The first impediment listed is age. 16 for men, 14 for women. Below that, your marriage would be invalid. You might think, well, that's a little low, and we actually do have other laws about marriage that say, for example, you can't have a wedding that would be against the civil laws of the land. So if the law of the land says you must be 18 to marry, you can't just get married in the church without some kind of special permission. Or also if you're a minor and you're marrying without your parents' permission. Again, we have special laws in place for that. But in this norm, we're just talking about what the ecclesiastical law is that invalidates, and that's 16 for men, 14 for women. This is an ecclesiastical law, so technically it could be dispensed, but it rarely is. And even then, there's a natural limit below which it could not be dispensed, because you do have to have reached a certain level of maturity to be able to carry out the obligations of marriage. Canon 1084 is about physical impotence. This is about being able to do the act necessary for having children. Since marriage is about creating an environment in which it's possible to bring children into the world and to raise them. It's important to emphasize that this is different from sterility. So it's possible that in the course of your married life, you discover that for one reason or another, whether it's because of the man or because of the woman, it's not possible to actually have children. But this impediment is only about the ability to do those acts that lead to having children. More detail could be given about this, but it's helpful if you have any doubts about this to ask your tribunal. And this is also something that pertains to natural law. Because it pertains to the very essential obligations of marriage, it cannot be dispensed by any ecclesiastical authority. Canon 1085 is about prior marriage. If you're already married, you cannot get married again. So any marriage you attempt after being married once would be invalid until it's been sufficiently established with certitude that the first marriage was actually itself invalid. This pertains again to divine law, the nature of marriage, and so it cannot be dispensed by any authority. Canon 1086 is what's called disparity of cult, or sometimes called the impediment of mixed religion. And so if you have a baptized Catholic and that person wants to marry someone who's not baptized, the starting point for that is that it would be invalid. But because this is an ecclesiastical law, it can be dispensed, but there are some conditions for which it can be dispensed. So it's important to observe all those, and your pastor can bring you through all those. Canon 1087 says those in holy orders invalidly attempt marriage. So a priest or anyone else in holy orders who attempts to marry would do so invalidly. This is an ecclesiastical law, so it's been laid down by the church, and it can only therefore be dispensed by the church, but not just any bishop, because it's such a grave matter, such a grave subject. It's the kind of thing reserved to the Holy See. Only the Pope or someone who he's given the authority to can dispense from this impediment. Canon 1088 is an impediment on those who have taken a public perpetual vow of chastity in a religious institute. So notice all those adjectives: public perpetual vow of chastity in a religious institute. If any of those are missing, there's not a diriment impediment. But if you're one of these people described by the law, you would invalidly attempt marriage. And just like holy orders, because of the gravity of this subject, only the Holy See has permission to dispense from this impediment. Canon 1089 is about abduction. If you have kidnapped someone or detained someone with the intention of marrying them, you would invalidly attempt to marry them. So this law says you have to return them to a place, at least return them to a place where they'd be free to deliberate and make a decision to marry, and then it's possible to marry. So this is kind of a strange sounding law, but it's because of historical situations over the centuries that it's been established for the sake of preserving the freedom of those entering into marriage. Canon 1090 is the impediment of crime. This is another strange one, but again, historical cases have led to this being established. It's related to the impediment of prior bond. And so let's say you got a guy named Jack, and he's in love with a girl named Susie, but Susie is already married to a guy named Luke. And so Jack says, well, I want to marry Susie, but she's already married, so I know, I'll conspire to have Luke killed. And so he does. So then you think, well, now Jack and Susie are free to marry, right? Wrong. There's this impediment that keeps that from happening, the impediment of crime. Which says that if anyone conspires to bring about the death of the spouse of someone you want to marry, or the death of your own spouse so that you can marry someone, your marriage is invalid. Obviously, this doesn't have to do with the nature of marriage, and so it's an ecclesiastical law, which means it could be dispensed, but because of the gravity of the matter, murder, it's reserved to the Holy See, who would deliberate on this sort of case. Canon 1091 is on consanguinity, which has to do with marrying people that you're blood relatives of. What the canon forbids is marriage with anyone in the direct line, so any of your ancestors, parents, grandparents, you could not validly marry. Any of your descendants, children, grandchildren, you could not marry for any reason. This canon forbids in the collateral line those within the fourth degree, inclusive. And so just to translate that, it forbids marrying your first cousin. So anyone beyond that is fine, but this canon forbids marrying your first cousin. Now, because it's at that point, it's actually an ecclesiastical law that could be dispensed by a bishop. But so it puts a hard limit on those in the second degree of the collateral line. Your siblings, you could never get a dispensation to marry your siblings or your parents or your children. And that's because you've reached the natural law limit at that point. Canon 1092 is about affinity, which is similar to consanguinity, but it's about the bonds arising from matrimony. And so if your spouse died, you could not then marry her parents or any of her children. They're not blood relatives, so this could be dispensed, but you'd have to have a pretty good reason for it. Canon 1093 is about a related matter to affinity. It's called public propriety. So basically, if you have a man who's been living with a woman in the manner of a husband and wife, he is thereby impeded from marrying, again, her immediate relatives. And this can be dispensed, again, because it's not part of natural law. But again, certain things would have to be taken into account. And finally, Canon 1094 is about the impediment of marrying those you're related to through adoption. Again, there's not a blood relation here, so there's nothing natural which impedes the relationship. But because of the ties that happen when one lives with someone as a sibling through adoption, this is reasonably impeded by ecclesiastical law, and it can be dispensed for a grave enough reason. So those are the 12 categories of impediments listed in the code that disqualify one from being juridically able to marry. If you're aware that one of these situations existed when you originally got married to someone, it should not be difficult to prove. Usually most of these can be proven through documentation. One of the more difficult ones is probably physical impotence, and that might take a few more steps, or something like abduction, where you have to show that really freedom was limited, in which case it might be more a consent case. If you have any questions about any of these, again, I highly recommend you don't simply rely on a video you watched online, but that you contact your pastor, your parish, or your diocesan tribunal, where they have experts who have studied these topics and who know the answers to questions you might have. God bless.